Today you will hear a testimony that will challenge everything you think about faith, ideology, and transformation. Her name is Emily Carter, a young American who became a symbol of the woke movement, a leader of fiery protests, a passionate defender of the Palestinian cause, and a declared enemy of Christianity. Her face appeared across social media, her speeches ignited auditoriums, until an unexpected encounter with Charlie Kirk during an explosive debate on the UCLA campus turned her life upside down. What began as a political confrontation ended as a supernatural calling, a battle between hatred and truth, between darkness and light. And believe me, what happened next will take your breath away. And before we begin, make sure you are already subscribed, leave your like, and tell us in the comments which city or country you are watching from.
When I look back and think about who I was, it feels like I am talking about another person. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, a place where the word faith was almost an insult. My parents, two respected intellectuals, taught at the university and believed religion was the root of all human conflict. At home, God was never mentioned, and when someone dared to bring him up, the atmosphere changed. My father used to say that believing in Jesus was the same as believing in fairy tales. I grew up hearing that as if it were absolute truth. In school, I was the questioning girl, the one who challenged teachers and mocked any student who talked about church. When I entered college, the environment felt made for me. Activism, debates, ideologies, and a sense of intellectual superiority. I felt alive shouting in the streets, holding signs, and talking about social justice. I marched alongside groups that claimed to be the voice of the oppressed and cheered for any speech that attacked Christianity. Little by little, I became a well-known figure on campus. People invited me to give lectures, to join panels and interviews. I wore the Palestinian scarf as a symbol of resistance, but deep down, I wore it as armor, something that hid the chaos inside me. I said I fought for the oppressed, but the truth was, I didn't even know what I was fighting for. I wanted to be accepted. I wanted to belong. I wanted someone to tell me I was right. My social media was an extension of my activism. I posted fiery videos, criticized conservative politicians, and mocked anyone who quoted Bible verses. I called Christians hypocrites and said Jesus was just a symbol created to control the masses. Everything I didn't understand, I attacked. It was as if every harsh word that left my mouth gave me a dose of power. And for a moment, it worked. The likes, the shares, the applause, all of it fed my ego. But when the lights went out and silence returned, I felt empty. The nights were the worst. I would lie in bed, and sleep never came. My heart raced, and my mind wouldn't stop. I replayed every argument, every speech, every online fight, trying to prove that I was on the right side of history. But deep down, I felt something was terribly wrong. I couldn't explain it, but that constant feeling of anger was eating me alive. I told myself that the fight was my purpose, but that fight was consuming me. My health began to collapse. I lived with headaches, had anxiety attacks and panic episodes I tried to hide, but I never admitted weakness. Anger was my strength, and activism was my refuge. When I saw Christians praying in public squares or holding signs with messages of love, I felt a mix of contempt and envy. Why did they look so at peace while I felt at war all the time? I didn't know that my war wasn't with the world. It was with God. And he was already chasing me, even when I hated him. It was in that context that something unexpected happened. The university announced an open event, a debate between Charlie Kirk and a renowned social studies professor about freedom of speech. As soon as I heard, I gathered the activist group I led. The idea was simple: interrupt the debate, make noise, and show that this kind of discourse would not be tolerated. I was excited. It felt like the perfect opportunity to prove, in front of everyone, that I was right. The auditorium was packed, cameras were rolling, and the students were buzzing with energy. I entered with my group, and as soon as Charlie began to speak, the shouting started. Fascist! Extremist! Silence the oppressor! The voices echoed off the walls. Charlie stood calmly, without raising his voice. Then he looked directly at me. It disarmed me for a moment. With a firm but unhostile tone, he said, Do you really believe you can preach tolerance while shouting to silence someone else? For a few seconds, time froze. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't. The microphone was offered to me, and pushed by my group, I went up on stage. My heart was pounding out of rhythm, but I had to defend my ideology. I began to talk about power structures, cultural colonialism, and systemic oppression. The words came out rehearsed, memorized, but as I spoke, I realized no one was really listening, and the worst part, I didn't even believe half of what I was saying. Charlie waited patiently until I finished. Then he replied, without changing his tone, "Truth doesn't depend on what you feel. Truth is a person, and his name is Jesus." The audience went silent. I stood still. It was as if those words had pierced something deep inside me. I left the stage trying to hide it, but inside, I was shattered. That phrase echoed in my mind over and over. That night, lying on my dorm bed, I couldn't sleep. I closed my eyes and saw his gaze, calm, steady, without hate. He didn't want to win the debate. He wanted to reach me, and that infuriated me more than anything. Truth is a person. What did that even mean? I, who had always mocked any form of faith, was for the first time feeling fear of what I didn't understand. In the following days, I tried to ignore what had happened, but the memories came back stronger. I rewatched the video of the debate, and suddenly, my own words sounded empty, like an echo in a cave. I felt ashamed. For the first time, I doubted myself. I remember the exact moment when pride began to crack. It was late at night, and I was alone in my room. The laptop screen showed my own face during the debate, tense, arrogant, full of rage. I closed the computer and sat in silence for a few minutes. Then, something unexpected happened. I began to cry. I didn't know why. It was in that state of confusion that, for the first time in my life, I spoke to God. I didn't know how to pray. I didn't know what to say. I just whispered, "If you are real, show me." The room was dark, only the distant sound of cars on the street. And suddenly, a strange peace began to surround me. I felt warmth in my chest, as if something invisible was embracing me. I looked around. No one there. But the feeling was real. It was as if a presence completely enveloped me, and a gentle voice, not coming from outside but from within, whispered, "I have always been here." In that instant, something broke inside me. All the anger, the fear, the resentment, it all began to fade away. I fell to my knees on the floor, crying uncontrollably, not out of sadness, but out of release. I felt as if I were being washed from the inside, as if the weight I had carried for years was finally lifted. The tears fell, and I could only repeat, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know." That room, which had once been a battlefield, became a sanctuary. A faint, almost imperceptible light seemed to fill the space, and for a moment, time stopped. I didn't hear thunder. I didn't see angels. There was no spectacle. Only a deep certainty that I was no longer alone. It was as if an invisible hand touched my heart and said, "Now you are mine." And for the first time in many years, I felt peace. A peace that made no sense, but was absolutely real. I didn't understand everything that was happening, but I knew something inside me had changed. I was no longer the same person who had entered that room. What I didn't know was that this would only be the beginning of a long journey, a journey of confronting my past, my beliefs, everything I thought was true. I still didn't have answers, but in that moment, for the first time in my life, I had hope, and it was there, on my knees, in the silence of the early morning, that my war began to end. The next morning, when I opened my eyes, I felt something different. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the air itself had become lighter. It was as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For a moment, I thought it was just the emotional exhaustion of the night before. But when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw something I had never seen before. Peace. The face that once carried tension and fatigue now looked serene. The eyes that once reflected anger and confusion now seemed calm, almost illuminated. As I walked through the university halls, I could feel the curious stares. Some classmates laughed, others whispered. One of them joked, "Hey, Emily, what happened?" Were you abducted by Christians? I just smiled. There was no anger, no desire to answer with sarcasm like I always did. Something inside me had truly changed. I couldn't explain it rationally, but I knew the hatred was gone. During classes, I noticed that the professor's words sounded different. It was as if the same reality I had always seen now had new colors, new sounds. I looked at people and no longer saw them as enemies, but as broken human beings trying to make sense of life, just as I was. It was strange to realize that. I had spent so many years believing the world was divided between good and evil, convinced I was on the right side of the fight, that seeing everything in a new light felt like a miracle. The following days were confusing. I alternated between moments of deep peace and intense doubt. At times, I wondered if everything I had experienced that night was real, or just an emotional breakdown. But there was something in me that wouldn't let me doubt completely, that feeling of presence, that gentle voice saying, "I have always been here." It was something no ideology, no book, no protest had ever given me. One afternoon, as I crossed the university courtyard, I saw a poster announcing another lecture by Charlie Kirk. For a moment, my heart raced. I hesitated, but something inside me urged me to go. When I arrived at the auditorium, most of the seats were already taken. He was speaking about truth, freedom, and responsibility, themes that, ironically, I had once twisted in my old speeches. When the event ended, people began to leave. I stood there watching. My thoughts collided with one another. I knew I needed to talk to him, but my legs felt glued to the floor. Finally, I took a deep breath and walked toward the stage. He was talking with some students, but when he looked at me, he smiled as if he already knew who I was. "You're the girl from the debate, right?" he said naturally. I nodded, nervous, and the words began to pour out before I could organize them. I told him what had happened that night. The feeling, the voice, the peace. I told him everything, unable to hold back my tears. He listened in silence, with a calmness that unsettled me. When I finished, he simply said a sentence that echoed deep within me. "You asked for the truth." And the truth answered. Those words hit me like a wave. It was as if he had spoken aloud what my heart already knew. And for the first time, I realized that the miracle I was living had nothing to do with religion, rituals, or dogma. It was something alive, personal, real. From that day on, I began attending weekly gatherings with a small Christian group on campus. At first, I felt out of place. Everyone seemed so confident, so at peace, and I still carried doubts. But they never judged me. They welcomed me with kindness, listened to me, prayed with me, and taught me about the Bible, the very book I had once mocked and criticized. I remember the first time I read the Gospel of John. When I reached the words, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," my heart began to race. It was as if Jesus himself were speaking directly to me. With every page, I felt as though layers of lies were being peeled away from me. The hatred that once fueled me was replaced by something new, compassion. And the voice that once spoke inside my room now seemed to guide me through every verse. My first miracle wasn't visible to anyone else. It wasn't physical. It wasn't something that could be recorded or proven. But inside me, a spiritual battle had been won. It was the healing of my soul. However, I still had no idea what was coming. The inner transformation began to bring outward consequences. Not long after, my old activist friends noticed that I was no longer attending meetings, protests, or online groups. One of them messaged me, "What's going on with you? Are you turning into a Christian fanatic?" I tried to explain, but I realized it was useless. They didn't want to understand. They just wanted to label me. As the weeks went by, the invitations disappeared. The messages stopped, and suddenly, silence. The same group that once applauded me now completely ignored me. Soon the public insults began. They called me a traitor, a sellout, a manipulated fool. I lost the research grants I had worked so hard to earn. I was removed from the student group I had founded myself. I remember the day I walked into the meeting room and found my chair taken by someone else. They said my new mindset no longer represented the group's values. I left with a heavy heart, but strangely, without anger. I only felt sadness, not for myself, but for them, because now I saw everything through different eyes. But the hardest blow was yet to come. My family's reaction. When I told my parents what was happening, my mother stayed silent for a few seconds, then laughed in disbelief. You? Emily? The girl who grew up listening to Dawkins and Nietzsche? You're joking, right? My father was more direct. This is dangerous. They've brainwashed you. That night was one of the hardest of my life. I locked myself in my room and cried like I hadn't cried since childhood. The feeling of rejection was immense, yet, even so, there was a flame that wouldn't go out. I felt that, despite everything, I was not alone. I began writing in a journal, something I had never done before. It was a way to put into words what I couldn't say out loud. On one of the pages I wrote, "They took away everything I thought defined me. Friends, position, recognition, and only then did I discover who I really am." From that moment, I realized that Christianity wasn't an escape, but a calling. The price of truth was high, but the lie I had lived before had cost much more. There were days when I thought about giving up. The criticism on social media was intense. Mocking comments, memes, threats. Some nights, I deleted everything and just stared at the empty screen, wondering if it was worth continuing. But then I opened the Bible and read verses that felt like they had been written just for me. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Those words sustained me. They reminded me that pain was part of the process, that the cross comes before the resurrection. At the Christian group meetings, I began sharing my struggles. Many cried with me. Others shared their own stories of rejection and faith. I realized that God was using even my losses to shape me. It was as if He were saying, "You asked for the truth, and the truth will set you free, even if it costs you everything you have." Over time, I began to see things from a new perspective. I realized that the true miracle wasn't the absence of pain, but the ability to remain steadfast in the midst of it. Every tear, every insult, every loss became part of something greater, part of a purpose I didn't fully understand yet, but one I felt deeply. People said I had gone crazy, but for the first time I felt sane. The whole world seemed to have changed. But in reality, it was my heart that had been transformed. And so, even without fully understanding what would come next, I knew that this new journey was only beginning. What I didn't yet know was that my faith would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined. The following months became a true testing ground for my new faith. I was no longer the same person, but the world around me remained unchanged. And not everyone was willing to accept my transformation. Still, something inside me burned with a purpose I couldn't ignore. I began sharing my story in small prayer groups on campus, then in local churches. At first, my hands trembled as I held the microphone. I was afraid of being judged, of being mocked, but each time I spoke, I felt God's presence giving me courage. I told how a heart filled with hatred had been transformed by love, and little by little, I realized that my testimony wasn't just a story about me. It was a bridge to others who were trapped in the same lies that had once blinded me. It was during that time that something unexpected happened. One night, while reading through messages on my social media, I came across a name that made me freeze: Layla. For a second, I thought it was a coincidence. But when I opened the message, my heart stopped. It was her, my old friend from the movement, a young Palestinian woman I had met years earlier at a student congress on social justice. Layla was intense, passionate, and full of pain. She was writing to me from Gaza, in the midst of destruction. Her words were desperate. "Emily, my house was hit. I don't know if my mother and brothers are alive. I don't know what to believe anymore. You talk about peace. Where is that peace?" I read that message dozens of times. I cried in silence. Memories came back like an avalanche. The conversations, the marches, the fiery speeches. Layla had been one of the people who most inspired me to embrace that blind activism. And now she was lost, wounded, searching for something that hatred could never give. I knew I couldn't ignore her. I spent the night praying, asking for direction. I prayed for Layla, for her family, for her land, and for the first time, I realized I was praying from a different place. There were no more sides. There was only pain. And in the middle of that pain, a calling for something greater. Days later, I heard about a large event in Washington, D.C., bringing together voices from different religions and ideologies to talk about reconciliation and peace. I felt I needed to be there, even though part of me feared what might happen. Something inside me said that would be a turning point in my journey. I arrived at the event with a few Christian friends. The place was packed. Journalists, activists, community leaders. When they saw my name on the list of speakers, some began to murmur. I saw looks of contempt, heard whispers. Many knew who I was. The former radical activist who surrendered to religion. Deep down, they knew my presence there would cause discomfort. As I waited for my turn to speak, a woman approached me and said in a sharp tone, "You shouldn't be here. You betrayed the cause." I simply replied, "Today, my cause is the truth." When my name was called, my legs felt weak. I walked onto the stage with my heart racing. The lights blinded me, and the silence from the audience was almost suffocating. I took a deep breath and began to speak. Not with anger, but with truth. I told my story, spoke about the darkness that had consumed me, about the day I found light in the middle of confusion. And then I mentioned Layla. I said she had written to me, asking for answers, asking for hope. As I spoke, some people began to boo. Others raised signs. Security guards moved closer, anticipating trouble. I could feel the hatred in the air, but something stronger pushed me to continue. That was when the words came out of my mouth. Unplanned, unrehearsed. Today I'm not here to take sides. I'm here to pray. For Israel and for Palestine. The hall went silent. I closed my eyes and began to pray out loud. It wasn't a political speech. It was a cry, a sincere plea for God to heal hearts, free those imprisoned by hatred, and bring peace where war seemed eternal. As I prayed, tears began to fall. I felt that it wasn't me speaking anymore. It was the Spirit of God using my voice. When I opened my eyes, I saw people crying. Others were on their knees. Some, even those who had mocked me minutes earlier, looked disarmed. The cameras captured everything. That moment spread across social media within hours. The video of the prayer went viral, reaching millions of views. Some called me a traitor, others a hypocrite. But many, countless in fact, began writing to say they felt something different while hearing those words. People from different countries, religions, and beliefs said they cried while watching. What was meant to be just another political event turned into a spiritual movement, and I understood that God had transformed my old activism into a ministry. The response was intense. Some news outlets attacked me with sarcastic headlines, but I felt no need to reply. Because for the first time, I saw the difference between fame and purpose. I no longer wanted to be the loudest voice in the room. I wanted to be the voice that pointed upward. In the following days, I received another message from Layla. This time, it was short, but powerful. I watched. I felt peace. Thank you. Those words made me cry for hours. There, in front of the screen, I realized that God hadn't just rescued me. He was using my life to reach others. And that's how the woman who once fought for ideologies began to fight for souls. The activist who once carried flags now carried the cross. I no longer wanted to win debates. I wanted to save hearts. After that event, my life changed completely. I was invited to share my testimony at other universities, conferences, and radio programs. But I never failed to say that it all began with a simple encounter with the truth. A living truth that set me free. Today, as I write these memories, I live in Austin, Texas. I live in a small apartment filled with books, plants, and memories of a life that no longer belongs to me. In the morning, I wake up early, make my coffee, and open my Bible. It's the first sound of my day, the whisper of the pages reminding me who I am now. I lead a discipleship group for college students. Many come full of doubt, anger, and confusion, just like I once did. I listen, embrace, and teach with patience. I tell my story not to be admired, but so they can see that there is redemption, even for the hardest hearts. Sometimes I look at that same campus where it all began and remember the girl who shouted for justice, without realizing she was a prisoner of hatred. Today, I speak to young people who are fighting the same battles, and I tell them, the truth is not a flag, it is a person. In our weekly gatherings, we open the Bible together. I teach them to question, but also to listen, to think, but also to feel. Because faith is not the denial of reason. It is the complement that gives reason its meaning. There is something poetic in seeing how God turns ruins into seeds. With every testimony, I see hearts being restored. Young people who, like me, once thought faith was a prison discover that it is true freedom. Recently, I was invited to share my testimony at a large Christian conference. When I walked onto the stage and looked out at the crowd, I felt the same sensations I had years ago. The fear, the anticipation, the emotion. But this time, there was one difference. I knew I was no longer alone. I spoke about my journey, about the debate with Charlie Kirk, about Layla's message, and about the day I discovered that love is more powerful than any ideology. And when I finished, the silence was followed by applause, not for me, but for the one who transformed me. After the event, a young woman approached me and said, "I was like you. I used to hate everything that came from faith, but now I want to know this Jesus who changed you." I smiled and hugged her, feeling that the story was repeating itself and that God was writing new chapters through me. The woman who once hated Christians now prays with them. The activist who shouted in the streets now speaks gently about the power of Christ. And every time I remember that debate at UCLA, that moment when it all began, I smile and whisper to myself, that's where my war ended. But deep down, I know, this is not a story about the end of a war. It is about the beginning of a new mission, a mission that carries no human flags, but the living truth that transforms hearts, reconciles nations, and restores souls. And it is this mission that makes me wake up every day with the same certainty that changed my life. The truth has won, and its name is Jesus.
Emily's story reminds us that no one is ever too far to be reached by the love of God. He finds his children even in the most unlikely places, in universities, in protests, in hardened hearts. When truth enters, hatred leaves. When Jesus speaks, even the most radical heart surrenders. The past doesn't matter. God always writes new beginnings. How many times have we also fought the wrong battles, chasing truths that only leave us empty? Emily discovered that true freedom doesn't come from shouting louder, but from surrendering to the one who is the truth. And maybe today, that same voice is speaking to you right where you are, calling your name with the same tenderness that called hers. So I want to ask you something very simple, yet powerful. Make sure you're already subscribed to this channel. Here we share real stories, testimonies that touch, heal, and transform. Also, leave your like, because it helps this message reach more people. And if this story touched your heart, write in the comments, "I love Jesus." That's a public declaration of faith, an act of love, a spiritual seed that can change destinies. And get ready, because the next video now appearing on your screen will move you deeply. From Saudi prince to Christian refugee, a true story of faith and courage. Prepare your heart, because what's coming next is simply powerful.